Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project here at the University of Texas at Austin. Glad to be joined again today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Hanging in there?
Yeah. You said
good
that.
Answer. Good answer.
No, it's funny. Right as you said that, like that stupid poster of that cat, little kitten hanging on the clothesline, it says, hang in there. I was like, yeah, I got it.
My little kitty paws are a little sore.
Yeah, well, they usually land on their feet.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, good free association. That's not really free association. That's just an association.
Yeah, I like to think about those things.
All right. Well, so we're here to talk about some of the results in our February poll, which is your hearing this, we probably just released, depending on the timing. There's a lot in the poll. We'll probably come back to some of it next week. I mean, for the moment, all things considered, given where we are, we're going to focus on the Senate primary race results that we got in this poll. We may hit on a thing or two along the way, but, obviously this is a race getting national attention on both sides in these primary races. But before we dive into that, let's get the housekeeping on the poll out of the way. Tell us a little about the methodology of the poll, timing, et cetera, Josh.
Yes, of course. This, just as a quick aside, if this is something you're really interested in, a full methodology statement for this poll and every single poll we conduct, 75 plus, are all available on the texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So if you want to dive into the specifics, but in general, we were in the field from February 2nd to the 16th. That's important. So if you all are kind of keeping track of the various ins and outs of these different races and who said what, when, and YouTube and all that, that's when we were in the field. So just, good to keep in mind as we go through this is that we can't account for anything that's happened since then. Overall, the poll we have a slight oversample here in two senses. Normally we survey 1,200 registered voters, self-declared registered voters. This time was 1,300 self-declared registered voters. Part of that is because of the primary. We were looking to get an oversample, so we have of primary voters. So we have an additional oversample of Republican and Democratic primary voters on top of the 1,300 from which we talk about these primary results. The short version of this is that essentially the registered voters who make up our primary voter samples for the Republican and Democratic side have participated in a primary in the last 3 election cycles and indicate that they are going to participate in this upcoming primary. And as we know from a lot of social science research and doing this a lot, for a number of times, one of the nice, silly things of social sciences is, one of the most predictive, indicators of voting in a primary, having voted in a primary. And so,
right.
I'll say, we can get into this later if we have time for it or whatever. We looked at a lot of different ways to do this and different screens we might apply and different ways we might, think about how the electorate's going to look. And the interesting thing was just to say the results we're going to report are pretty robust across the various screens we could have applied in different ways and approaches. So we're, I think...
And with the overall sample.
And with the overall samples. We could bring in more people, we could have fewer people, and ultimately the results were pretty robust across the range of screens. So we stuck, with one we've used before and we feel is pretty robust and reliable.
Right, and we'll talk about the number of respondents in each of the two races we're talking about. But, remember, the margin of error will be bigger because these are smaller subsets.
Yeah, which we should expect, right, everybody? Because obviously the share of voters who actually participate in these primaries is a pretty small subset of the overall electorate. And so it's one of those challenges as a pollster all the time is everybody says they're interested, everybody says they're going to vote, but we know for a fact not true. So we need to deal with that. Not everybody
says they're going to vote is votes.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are obviously lots of different ways we could have done this. And, as we're out and about or if you're a reporter or something, you have a question, shoot us an email.
Yeah, if it sounds like we've been thinking about it a lot, we have.
Yeah. So seems to me we'll start on the Republican side for no other reason. Yeah. That's the party of the incumbent who is seeking re-election. Not expressing any real preference here, just that's a good conventional place to start. Now, this race has been going on for a very long time.
Feels like forever.
It's come down to a 3-person race, basically. The two men that have been facing off for a long time, certainly prior to really formal declarations, incumbent John Cornyn and Attorney General Ken Paxton, and also joined more lately or after the fact by Congressman Wesley Hunt, late entrant but playing a very big role. The summary here is this race is headed for a runoff, but why don't you tell us what the poll told us about this race directly and what those results look like, Josh?
Yeah, we can dig in a little bit. So overall, real quick, again, this is among let's say potential Republican primary voters, likely Republican primaries, among a sample of what we think of as a good representation of the Republican primary electorate. Overall, it's about 350 respondents. This produces a margin of error at the top line. So the result I'm about to say for plus or minus 5.24%, which is more than enough in this race, because the poll finds Ken Paxton with a slight lead, but very much within the margin of error at 36%, incumbent John Cornyn at 34%, Representative Hunt at 26%, and then really nobody else above 1%, and there's a slight 2% who say they will be voting for some unnamed someone else. So really, these three candidates are sucking up the lion's share of the support, and that's where all the support is going. But as we point out, the difference between Paxton and Cornyn right now is statistically indistinguishable. Is that like a surprising result to you? Does it make sense? I mean, we haven't really talked about just like a gut reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, my first look at this didn't make me nervous, put it that way.
Yeah.
In the way that we get nervous about, what's our saying, what kind of an estimate are we getting, et cetera. And particularly for when we're in the field, which as we record, this is now about a little more than a week ago, about 9 days ago, right?
Yeah.
We came out 9-10. I think I might have expected a slightly larger lead for Paxton, but that's what
I would say.
This race has been hard to estimate all along, and as you were saying earlier, when you look at the internals of this race, most of it seems to make sense to me.
Yeah.
But mostly to the extent that in the key groups, these candidates are just running very, very close to each other.
Yeah, let's unpack it.
Let's drill into some.
Yeah, let's unpack it. So I think there's some. I think you can divide these results into sort of the unsurprising, like this confirms what we thought we understood, and then there's sort of the, I think, slightly more interesting pieces of it, to my mind, right? So the first is, what we've seen all along, right? So if we break this trial ballot down and we look at some of the groups that we expect to, sort of really be consequential in Republican primaries, in particular the most conservative voters, this is where Paxton runs the strongest and where Cornyn runs the weakest. So among the most conservative voters, those who say they're extremely conservative on like a 7-point scale, they could be somewhat, but these are the people who say, no, right. I am conservative, right? And there, Paxton's at 41%, Hunt is at 30%, and Cornyn's at 27%. Now, if we look at those voters who identify as moderates in the Republican Party, now again, in the Republican Party, not a huge share of those voters.
Not very many people, so particularly in the primary, right?
But ultimately, that flips where Cornyn is now the choice of 43, Paxton's the choice of 27, and Hunt is the choice of 18. So that's like a little bit of the underlying dynamic that has motivated all the interests and everything that we've been seeing, kind of all along in this discussion, right?
Yeah, and just to tie that to some of the discourse around this election. I mean, if you're a Paxton supporter, you look at that and say, see, told you.
Right.
Basically, John Cornyn is too moderate, et cetera. And now that's endogenous here. Right. I mean, don't want to make that mistake. But it fits what we're seeing, and it suggests to me that the Cornyn campaign's efforts to say, look, I've voted with Donald Trump 97% of the time. I am unquestionably a conservative. I mean, if I was John Cornyn, I'd be going, look at me.
Yeah, right.
Right. But
look at the boots.
Not to be too facetious, but I mean, but looking at his voting record, they're making that argument, and I think this suggests that they're not really making headway with that.
Well,
I don't know. I mean,
what's interesting?
They're not. Let's put it this way: they're not disrupting perceptions, probably.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been trying to kind of deal with all along in sort of being an observer, commentator, on this race, is sort of squaring the fact that, yes, Cornyn has this weakness. This weakness has been there for a long time. I mean, we have to go back a ways in the polling to figure out when exactly this started, but it's been there for a long time. And yet, He wins Republican nominations. He wins re-election. And so part of this is to say is, okay, so in and of itself, we know that these voters are really driving a lot of the discussion in these races. We know that they hold an overwhelming or an overrepresentative share in those populations. And yet, here we are at 36, 34, 26. So the question then is, okay, so why? And that's where I think a little bit more of the data is kind of interesting, which is in some ways looking at this data, I can see the rationale for the Hunt candidacy a little bit more.
Sure.
Because once you start looking at the fave, unfaves in particular, in a couple ways you can look at this and cut this down in a couple different senses.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's move into the fave, unfaves, I think, for now. And just, again, remind people now, these are fave, unfaves.
We can do it either way. I mean, we can do it among the whole electorate, or we can do it among the Republican primary electorate.
Well, if you've got notes on the, let's talk about the Republican.
Yeah,
primary
I think it actually
that's fine. It's more directly relevant. I just wasn't sure we had that there.
Yeah, and we should say, this is a discussion we've had here. On the website, we're going to be releasing these results among all registered voters. I have these results among the primary voters. To some degree, we have to make choices about what is going to be the most digestible for the largest group of people when our goal is clarity and not confusion.
Well, and also remember, I mean, this is a good, boring but still important methodological point. We are talking about a smaller subset, a smaller sample size. Right. And so the margin of error on these subgroups is pretty big.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And so, I mean, remember when we say we're talking about Hunt voters, well, you're talking about, a quarter of the 350 primary voters. So you're not talking about a ton of people.
Not a lot of cases.
Not a lot of cases here. But it doesn't mean that we can't find some information from this, especially because part of this is, we can look at the RV numbers and see how they look. Then we can look at the subset of people who are in the Republican primary, compare it to the RV numbers and see, among similar groups, how they look. I think the interesting thing that sort of struck me in this is when you go in and you look at the fave unfaves, right? And you go into the Republican primary sample, the people who are making a choice on this ballot. And we look at John Cornyn favorability numbers, 42 fave, 40 unfave. Now, okay, that shows you why an incumbent is in the position he's in. At the same time, you go to Ken Paxton, same group, 46 fave, 37 unfave. Oh, okay. So maybe, again, those are not the same people, and it's important to know. Those are probably, the overlap on those is probably pretty minimal.
Both of those converge on about 4 in 10 having an unfavorable view of those candidates, right?
Exactly. So therein lies a challenge for both of those candidates. And so I think, that's sort of the first takeaway. And even when you look at sort of the extreme, the most conservative voters in the Republican primary electorate, Cornyn's underwater with those voters, again, in the Republican primary electorate. 42 a favorable opinion of him, 48% unfavorable opinion. Paxton's at 65 favorable. He's still 22% unfavorable amongst the most conservative voters in the Republican electorate. So it's not like he's uniformly viewed favorably amongst this sort of core group and really amongst his base voters. So I think that's the first observation, digging into that data is that, and I say, this speaks to sort of the Hunt role in this race. I definitely, and I should just admit, I probably overly discounted Hunt's chances in this race because I think there's just a lot of factors that make his chances very, very slim. And it just is what it is. It just has to do with, he's not a statewide candidate, all those things, right? At the same time, I can look at this data now that we're looking at these trials, and I can see what his people were looking at and telling him. He's saying, hey, look, neither of these guys is hitting it out of the park with the Republican electorate right now. There is a space for someone else.
Right.
But then that sort of raises the next question, if you want to move to that, which is, let's say Hunt doesn't make the runoff, right? What does this tell us about his support?
I just want to spell that out. I mean, I think please. That's where we're going. Yeah. But just to spell out the Hunt piece, the instrumental argument you're making to your client or the candidate that you're trying to get in this race is, yes, you would be the underdog. High chance you'll force a runoff, probably a low probability you'll make it. But if you'll make it, each of these candidates has a real wellspring of opposition to them that is probably exploitable in a runoff.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I just wanted to kind of lay out the logic of that a little bit. So.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So I mean, if you think about it, whereas Wesley Hunt voters hold reasonably, negative views of both of the other candidates, which again, there's a logic to that, right? Let's not, make too much of that. That makes a lot of sense here. When we look at the favorability numbers amongst the Republican primary sample, the highest favorability numbers are among the people who say they're going to vote for that candidate, right? That makes tons of sense.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a lot of more variation amongst the others, but the question is how much variation, right? I mean, I'll say when we get to the Democratic side, it's not as though there's a lot of negative Democratic attitudes crossing over between Crockett and Talarico. Here is not the case. That's not what we're seeing here. So here, when we look at Hunt voters, for example, for Cornyn, 35 have a favorable view, 45 an unfavorable view. For Paxton, 43 favorable, 37 unfavorable. So it's a slight advantage to Paxton, on the whole, but slight. Yeah. And that's one of those things I think has been interesting to me throughout this whole contest, is the arguments being made about, the nature of Hunt's supporters. And a lot of people have been talking with like this certainty about, exactly how it is that, which space he occupies and who he's drawing from. And you look at this data and you're kind of like, well, yeah, I don't know. I think it's just general discontent that he's picking up there, it looks like, because it's not as though his voters look like they lean particularly towards, whatever you want to say, the most conservative choice, or a less most conservative choice, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to say moderate, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we'll get to the Democrats, but it's an interesting dynamic in both of these races. There's almost like a ideological spectrum, our conservative, or our ideological purity, whatever you want to call it, a kind of ideological integrity test.
Yeah.
That is pretty hard to sort out, I think. I mean, each particularly in the Republican side, there is a institutional factor that enters in here that makes people think of John Cornyn as whatever his voting record, whatever his ideological history. It's almost as if his institutional affiliation combined with his his occasional criticism of Trump, and the fact that once, in the interim of the Trump terms, he seemed, he got out in front of saying, yeah, I think it's okay that we're done with that for now.
Yeah.
Right. During the Biden term, and that is now, but that's not the conventional, usual left-right assessment.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, it's funny.
And so there's a strange interaction on both sides between, what we would think of as and it's never this clean anyway, but as a relatively isolated, spatial model. Sorry, let's just put this person on a space from center to right, put these candidates there, and make a judgment. I mean, style points count for a lot here.
Yeah, well,
right? And we're seeing that in both races.
Well, and I think
it's not the whole thing, and I'm sure there are Paxton supporters out there going, "Oh, you're full of crap."
Yeah.
Clearly John Cornyn is not as MAGA committed, or not as committed to the cultural issues that animate the right in Texas in the way that Paxton is. So I don't want to go too far with that. But, there is a way in which style is reinforcing this ideological placement, I guess, is one of the things
it's funny. I
grasp for here.
I wish our colleague Darren Shaw were here today, but he couldn't make it due to a scheduling conflict, because I think, we've talked in the past about, there's this ideological dimension, but maybe there's this sort of institutional dimension, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, and if you think about it that way, it's like Cornyn is much, if that's on the other axis, sorry, everybody, Cornyn is obviously much more on the, on the pro, whatever you want to call it, establishment institutional side. Paxton is clearly much more on the sort of the dissident, insurgent side of the institutional spectrum. And that is something that has been a dynamic in Republican Party politics. And honestly, if we think about it and just say it out right now, like, it's something that's going on right now, maybe not on the surface, but certainly under the surface in conversations you hear in and around town, in a state capitol about, sort of like, so, what does this mean next?
Yeah.
On a lot of this stuff.
Well, and it's driving, the preference of national Republicans, in a way that is important.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And probably even some Republican elites, but that, it's an issue that really splits, I think, Republican elites from the Republican base in the party.
Yeah. Now it is May I move on one other piece on this this ballot here? I was going to say the trends, which are interesting.
Yeah,
because I think
definitely.
There is something I think we both had the same, and I asked you the question. I hadn't really thought about it, but I had the same initial reaction to you, which is I'll put it this way: I wouldn't have been surprised had Paxton had a slightly wider lead than he did in this estimate. But then the answer, in some ways, is kind of where we come back to all the time when we watch John Cornyn campaign, which is, his numbers with Republicans tend to go up over the campaign season. And we see that again here. So when we look at his fav-unfav numbers, now this is among all Republicans.
Right. That's why I wanted to come back to that.
Specific. Yeah. But if we look, we go sort of to last year, for the most part, he was sitting in the low 40s in terms of favorability, mid to high 20, between 25 and 30%, let's just say, in terms of his unfavorability. This is among Republicans. And it really bottomed out to some degree in December. He was at 38 fav, 27 unfav. But, look, spend tens of millions of dollars, directly targeting your people. And in February 2026, he's at 50-21. And I would almost be, sort of like a little bit unsure about that, except for the fact that, where have his numbers also popped up like to these peaks again? It's amazing. October 2020, another election year, he's at 70% favorability among Republicans. June 2014, another election year, he's at 58 favorable among Republicans.
You've seen this movie before.
Well, and I'd say as a student of politics, I appreciate this so much because we say all the time, look, he's a good campaigner, he knows what to do. And this is a reminder, you don't run statewide and win in one office, let alone the other offices, 4 times in a row for almost 3 decades without knowing how to find your voters and communicate with them. And
right. And should Cornyn lose this election, which is more likely than not at this point.
Absolutely.
If Cornyn loses, doesn't get put it this way, doesn't get the nomination and then will de facto lost the election. It's going to be hard not to read that as having played out the string of a strategy that we've talked about a lot in here, which is this is the way the Senate is designed to induce you to behave.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
Institutional incentives are: you get 6 years, you spend about 4 or 5 of that, 4.5, doing kind of what you want within some parameters, obviously, but and you have some independence to do that. And then you begin to move back towards your electorate as you get closer to the election. And that's what we've been, I think, describing to some degree in the long-term pattern of Cornyn's favorability. But as people will be quick to point out, he has also used that Senate position in conjunction with probably some luck, but certainly some strategy to forestall serious primary challenges.
Yeah.
And now he's got a challenger, which is in part how the cards fall, and also just context, right? The changes that have been taking place in the party. I think in the last cycle, people were surprised that he didn't get a more serious challenger.
Yeah, but honestly, in some sense, what probably, it's interesting. I'm sort of looking at it. The first thing I'm thinking is, this notion, this pattern in which he sort of increases his favorability among Republicans probably has a natural decay in terms of visibility to keep regenerating it, because each time, again, requires you to do this again. And so therefore there are fewer people to bring back into your camp. And so that's definitely, a part of this.
And it's been a very dynamic period in which we've watched, the party has changed around Cornyn pretty
Yeah, I'm sort of sitting here looking at these numbers and I'm kind of waxing in my head, but I'm I don't really want to just jump out here on this. It would be a little bit too flimsy, to say the least. Right. But it's interesting. I'll say this, here we are talking all about, Cornyn versus Paxton. We look at Paxton's favorability numbers in the same poll, among all Republicans, and he's at 52-18. Cornyn is at 50-21, So to some degree, there is a sense that, again, I think, Cornyn has probably done the work of reminding, a lot of core Republican voters. If you start to dig into a lot of this stuff, we see Cornyn having a little bit more strength in some cases, in a lot of cases, with the stronger Republicans.
Right.
And so, part of that whole kind of institutional dissident dynamic thing may be playing out. Again, I guess I am getting over my skis a little bit. But I think, this is kind of how we're seeing this. And this is where it comes back to the thing we talk about all again is but what's representative of the Republican primary electorate?
Well, we've talked a lot on the podcast about the shifting definition of what it is to be a conservative.
Yeah.
But there's also a shift, with that is a shifting definition of what it is to be a Republican. And there are two senses in which if I'm a respondent and somebody says, are you Republican, Democrat, Independent? I say Republican, and then the follow-up, I go strong Republican. Mm-hmm. It could be strong Republican because you think of yourself as institutionally aligned to the party.
Yeah.
But in a more polarized system, you could also say I'm a strong Republican because it's the same as being a strong conservative.
Right, yeah.
And now in this environment, yet another third dimension, a strong Trump supporter, given that. And so what is going through people's minds when they say, yeah, I'm a strong Republican, can be different things. I think that's reflected in the almost even split between Paxton and Cornyn among strong Republicans, which is 37-36.
That's right, exactly.
Which is essentially even.
Yeah, which is great. I think
even.
Super interesting. And I think
very interesting.
And the way you lay that out, I really like. I want to say, I mean, that's exactly right, which is, there's a book called The American Voter, which lays out this idea of party ID. And in some sense, that notion of this attachment to the party is like so quaint. Yeah, right. I mean, I almost think of it in a very kind of like institutional, old school sense of like, it's like, well, you're going to the voting machine, you're clicking the levers, and there's Sally, she works for the party, and it's like, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about now. When you say you're a strong Republican or a strong Democrat, it's like, and your point is, it doesn't necessarily mean one thing to every person, and that's
right. There's so many countervailing tendencies within that right now, and there always are.
Yeah.
And I just that's pretty fascinating and very important. And I want to put a pin in this. I want to move to the Democrats,
for sure.
But we're going to come back. I want to come back to this and not forget to come back to it. And my pen just ran out of ink, so help me. But we don't want to leave this before we move to the Democrats going, okay, so if we, without pointing out and reiterating the point that we started with, that in this moment, in the heat of this primary, for a lot of the reasons that we were just talking about, but indicated in the data we started with, this is a very hard-fought primary.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of very strongly held, both positive and negative, more importantly, negative opinions about the two main candidates.
On the Republican side.
On the Republican side.
Yeah.
And so let's move and look at that on the Democratic side, which I think is, as you pointed out in shorthand already, is different. And we want to, I think, at the end, tease out that importance before we get out of here.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the Democratic. Give us the numbers on the Democratic side, the sample, and also the outcome.
Right. So here we end up with 369 potential or likely Democratic primary voters. Sorry, that makes a margin of error of plus or minus 5.1%. A little higher than the Republican side. Some of that just has to do with artifacts of sampling. I think some of it might actually have to do with a certain amount of overall interest and enthusiasm going on right now, but
it could even be a little piece of what we were just talking about too.
Yeah. So this is clearly even though there is a third candidate in the race, this is clearly a two-person race. In the top of this ticket, we have Jasmine Crockett at 56% and James Talarico at 44%. So in this estimate, Crockett escapes a runoff, which I think, the Democrats, as a party would certainly like, especially if the Republicans end up in a runoff.
So let me ask you what you asked me. When you first gander at this response, surprised, not surprised?
Well, I had like an epiphany, if you will.
Oh, nice.
Well, you heard it. I mean, so this isn't new for you, but I mean, in the coming, in the days leading up to this, just as an observer of all of this, I sort of have been finding myself in the situation, especially because, we take so many press calls that come in and they sort of lay out various theories of the case, whatever, and they want some kind of reaction and all that. And one of the things that I think is going on in both sides of the ticket is this sort of, there's an elite argument going on the one hand, and then there's sort of like a question. Let me say this. There's an elite argument going on, and then in a lot of cases, there's sort of a, let me just take that elite argument, let me just apply it to the electorate. And I think, we're always like, let's just pause for a second. So so on the Republican side, there's an elite argument about electability and about spending and resource, and all that stuff is very much taking place within the Republican.
Trying to look forward to a general election.
Yeah, right. All this stuff.
Electability.
Yeah, exactly. And that's all kind of stuff that is really, I've said this to many people, you probably said it too, that's really like efforts to, in a lot of cases, convince Donald Trump to endorse John Cornyn in most cases, because that's where these arguments are coming from, right? But that's not necessarily in part, but that's not indicative of necessarily, not entirely, but that's not indicative of what your run-of-the-mill Republican primary voter is necessarily thinking about here, about resource allocations across the electoral map in 2026. It's like, stop, right? And you're shaking your head. It's like, it sounds stupid, because it is, right? And
it's a function of where you sit,
right? So on the Democratic side, I'm like running around this, but in the last few days or last week or whatever, part of it is like saying, there's this argument for each of them that they're both making, and they're both kind of these high-level arguments. The Talarico argument has largely been that, Democrats are going to turn out and he's going to be a better vessel for like independent discontent or whatever, moderate discontent, so on and so forth. And this is just a shorthand sketch. The Crockett argument is essentially, unusual times require, a different kind of candidate. And, really would say is like, she probably speaks better to like the Democratic zeitgeist at the moment and sort of reflecting the way that they feel and is going to mobilize Democrats. There's a question of whether that's
more direct, more combative.
Right.
And also, and that will mobilize more otherwise passive Democratic.
Right. Especially in a midterm would be the idea. Right. And I think, if you just sort of stop for a second and say, on the one hand, we've got an argument that says this person's speaking to the Democratic base in language that they admit and trying to mobilize them. This person is making a strategic gambit about why they might be more electable. Oops, stop. The first argument sounds better. And I think, that was kind of my realization a few days ago. All along, her numbers have been very good. There's been almost no real negative backlash in the Democratic electorate that we can see or witness. And while Talarico is also running very well amongst that group, he's just not as well known as she is. And honestly, like the reasons she entered this race are still operative. She is still connecting with the Democratic electorate. So in some ways, I would say I was a little surprised. Maybe it's not a little bit wider, but also Talarico's been raising and spending a lot of money. We were in the field before, the Stephen Colbert, YouTube, censorship kerfuffle. And so, that's just sort of floating around out there. And we kind of joked about this. Normally people will say something important. You have to remind them how like minimal this is to most people. But, when 8, 9, 10 million people watch a video on YouTube, like given it the size of Texas primaries, it's not definitionally inconsequential,
right. That's exactly right. And I think it's good to just have that out there in terms of, you alluded to it indirectly, and remind people that we came out of the field right out. I think we were right after or even during the Allred blow up.
Yeah.
But before the Colbert issue. I want to go back a little bit just to underline how consistent the numbers, or what the numbers tell us about your description of these elite reads and what it looks like in the LV. I mean, because to go back to this notion of party, I mean, the Democrats have their own version of this, what is it to be a strong Democrat thing. And Crockett does well in terms of party loyalty among the party loyalists, among those who identify as strong Democrats. She has a 61-39 advantage.
Right.
Lower if you go to liberals but still an advantage, 52-48, but a closer split.
Yeah.
And so there is something to some things that I think we are picking up in the data, but also in the ether, about Crockett presenting as a strong Democrat, right? As somebody who, by virtue of any number of things, a combination, I think, of her image, her identity, her rhetoric, looks to a lot of Democratic primary voters like this is the Democratic Party circa 2026.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think it's not my line to say that the Democratic Party is a majority female party. It is a majority person of color of party, and a lot of Democrats would say women of color make up the backbone of the party. And when you look at where Crockett's advantage in the Democratic primary electorate lies, it's with those groups.
Yeah, let's look at that.
So, and this isn't to say this isn't. I would just I'll put the numbers out, and then I'm going to caveat it in a certain way. So I'm just going to say. So first of all, when we look among women, Crockett's leading Talarico 60-40, and again, in a Democratic primary, that is a huge amount of what the difference is being made up.
That's the biggest block of voters.
That's the biggest block of voters that's creating a problem for Talarico here. The other notable one is among African Americans. She's at 87-12. Now, this isn't to say that African Americans have a negative view of Talarico. They just don't have much of a view of him. So among that same primary electorate, just to jump into the fave unfave for 1 second, among African Americans, she's at 78-8 fave unfave. He's at 45-14. So it's almost, it's 40% without an opinion of him.
Right.
But for the most part, this is where she's running strong. Now, I think to some extent, look, I don't know how much of this is about, her identity, but also like this is the core of the Democratic primary electorate in a lot of ways, so it's sort of the fact that she's running so strong with these two groups really explains the advantage she has over Talarico. But it's not that these groups are expressing negative opinions of him. They're just expressing more positive opinions of her. And really, if anything, I wouldn't even say more positive opinions, but more awareness.
Right.
I mean, it's a big piece of this.
I want to include one more, and just because it's another important group. Crockett only narrowly leading among Hispanics, but leading. It's essentially tied given the size of the sample. But ahead, 4 points, 52-48 among Hispanic Latino voters. And then just to round it out, 47, Crockett 47, Talarico 53 among self-identified white voters. But all of this, I think, stepping back, and I put you on the spot with what did you think?
Yeah.
I thought this race was going to be a little bit closer.
Yeah.
Honestly, because it seems to me that Talarico has been on the upswing.
Yeah.
But it is consistent with something we've been saying in the podcast and in the write-up of the previous polls, which is that Talarico started at significant disadvantage in terms of name recognition, and he has not overcome that.
Yeah.
Completely. I mean, he's closed that. But how many people didn't have an opinion of Talarico in the voter sample, in the likely voter sample versus Crockett?
Overall? In the likely voter sample?
Yeah.
About 30%, 28% didn't have a view of Talarico, and for Crockett it was, 17%.
Yeah, that's
something like that.
So 11 points.
Yeah, no, that would about do it.
And again, I'm not saying that to know James Talarico is to love him necessarily.
No.
But to not know him is definitely to not love him.
Yeah, and I would say, one of the things that I think, this may be unfair, but I mean, I don't know. From my perspective, watching the campaigns play out thus far, I think one of the things that Crockett has done really well throughout the primary is not make much news. She entered the race very, very favorably viewed among Democratic voters, very well known, and the only knock on her is that, she might earn some media that might create some blowback, and she's basically avoided doing that.
Yeah, which is, I would say, pretty clearly to her advantage.
And it is 100% to her advantage. As we said before, on the podcast and elsewhere, like Talarico has been raising a lot of money. He needs to spend it because he's not in the same position as her, and he's still chasing her. Now, again, I think really, the big caveat is the Stephen Colbert thing was a big thing. We'll see what happens there. But
Talarico is not short on money.
No, but the challenge here is that, it's unlikely that he's going to make huge inroads among African American voters or women voters at this late stage. I mean, maybe a little bit among women. And he's running so even amongst the other groups in the Democratic primary electorate that, it's hard to see where he starts to pick up, these voters, right? I mean, because it's not as though we're looking at this and say, I mean, what is to say is like, if the electorate is basically 50-50, I mean, to me, what you say is like, that's a bit of a coin toss. That doesn't mean for any individual person it's a coin toss. But we sort of talk about like, if something was like 75-25, well, that's extreme. Like you could pick up 5 points, maybe. You could pick up 6 points and still overwhelmingly not be doing well with that group, but do better amongst other groups. When you're at 50-50, it's what's the appeal you're gonna you're gonna generate, and also it's harder to find the right voters. I mean, that's the other piece of this in terms of return on investment here. I mean, for Crockett, if you're going into African American neighborhoods and making sure that voters are showing up in the primary, they're likely your voters. If the Democratic women are turning out, good chance you're picking up a couple points with each of those. The rest of these groups, it's a bit of a coin toss. So the strategy for Talarico in this is a lot more challenging at this point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways that we could make it more complicated than it is.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
You know what I mean? I mean, in the sense that if you do, again, to mention Darren Shaw again, if you do the thing where you take the shares of people that are familiar with the candidate and make that the universe and recalculate the fave-unfaves, Talarico's in the ballpark.
Yeah, I almost did that this morning.
Yeah, he's doing fine, but it's a matter of he's got to make that case. And as you say, while he's been meeting new people, Crockett's been locking down the people she already knows.
Right.
To use a colloquial kind of way of thinking about that, and it's tough. the Colbert thing is a big thing, but of those, we have no way of knowing. We probably have some way of knowing, but I don't know how many of those 8+ million YouTube viewers are in Texas.
Yeah.
I do know that I get, in this entirely anecdotal, I've gotten more texts from friends out of state about Talarico than in state.
Yeah. Now let me make one caveat on these numbers in case, because as I said, right now, I think that's one sort of big outstanding thing is the Colbert thing. The other one is there is one area of the electorate where Talarico does do particularly well, and it's among voters under 30 in the Democratic primary. And there he was leading her 73-27. Now, of course, there's a wide margin of error on this. And again, this goes back to one of those challenges again, which is you say, okay, well, Talarico's doing great with, these younger voters. What if they make up a huge share of the Democratic primary? And I'd say, well, that would be unusual.
Yeah. And just that was a little bit but Talarico's 67. It's Talarico 67, Crockett 33 in the 18 to 29 group, right?
73-27.
Oh, okay. I think I'm looking at the wrong crosstabs, I think.
Yeah, 73-27 among 18 to 29-year-olds. So I mean, there is something there, and I would say, this speaks to, his social media strategy, his age, whatever. But it's also like, this goes back to one of those things again, you'll see this throughout the primary, a lot of tea leaf reading from various turnout, where the turnout is and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that is always a little bit misleading because different counties report at different times, different amounts of information and all this kind of stuff. And we don't really actually know anything about the way these people are voting. But this is where when people are going to say, like, I'm sure at some point you'll hear something from the Talarico campaign about, turnout around the campuses and we're feeling really strong. But it's also like that's a small share of the Democratic primary electorate when all is said and done, And so that's the challenge.
And Crockett has a substantial lead among the older cohorts.
Right.
Who are more likely to vote in both the 45 to 64 and the 65 plus range.
Exactly.
Right. So before we wind up, with this said, but we do want to make the point again and connect it with the Democratic primary. There's an interesting dynamic right now that I'm not sure exactly how I want to emphasize this, but both of these primaries are very internally focused right now.
Yeah.
For different kinds of reasons. On the Republican side, it's if the Republican base or elements of the Republican base, particularly those who support Ken Paxton, have been itching for this fight.
Yeah.
And as we were saying, there are groups of voters in those two camps that have deeply negative views of the leading candidates. Mm-hmm. And the Democratic race is not like that.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of focus here. As you said, there's another candidate on the ballot. There's a someone else option. But the Democrats are focused on these candidates.
Yeah.
But the negatives of the candidates in the eyes of the supporters are not very high.
Right.
Nonetheless, still very internally focused, which the point being, it's very hard to even have a serious discussion, it seems to me, about the electability argument.
Yeah.
Given that in November, given that all those elements are in play on both sides.
That's great.
And one of them is the intensity of the hostility in the Republican Party, frankly. Mm-hmm. And on the Democratic side, there's this issue of Talarico is still growing.
Right.
And still working, I would think, with increasing desperation to get his name out there and reach some kind of name recognition parity, ideally, with Jasmine Crockett, so that he gives people a real choice rather than the person they know versus some person they're kind of vaguely aware of.
Yeah.
Even allowing for the difficulty of changing the minds of some of those groups that you were talking about.
You said at the beginning, we should put a pin in this and come back to this. Maybe this
That's
is a good
what I'm
time.
doing. Yeah.
So you mentioned, I think this is like the big caveat for everything here in some ways. Caveat wrapper, it's a super volatile environment. You already mentioned all these internal dynamics. We mentioned the Talarico video multiple times. Hanging over this, Trump is coming to Texas.
What is he going to do Friday?
What is he going to do? And I should say, there's also a ton of money being spent in these races. In a way that we really, I would say, is not something we've seen recently, that I can think of in terms of, the nature and the spread of the spend. I mean, there's been some individuals who've spent a lot of money here and there, but not like this. And so I think, there's a lot just going on here. I think looking at this, I'm thinking what's really interesting to me, we've been talking about I keep thinking about the next story in some ways, partially just because I want to be done with these primaries. And of course, there'll probably be runoffs to deal with too.
Yes.
But you'll bear with us. I just want to be done with it. I've been talking about it for a long time. But I am really interested to see both on what you just brought up here, these internal dynamics. It's like, I'm curious to see what the making up period looks like. Yeah. Because there's going to need to be some serious making up. And the question is, when these candidates eventually go from 3 to 2 to 1, what do the 2 who aren't the 1 do to, give their supporters, the okay, or don't they, kind of thing. And I think that's something that's, look, in an environment.
And frankly, how much does it matter?
Well, I
think that's especially true on the Republican side.
Yeah, I'm mostly talking on the Republican side, because I was going to follow up by saying, in an election season in which the environment is going to be challenging for Republicans, they can't. I feel like this multiple. You can't be losing, tons of your. Not even tons. You can't be losing small slices of your base vote. That is necessary in order to be competitive. Everywhere it's necessary to be competitive. In Texas, when things are lining up relatively well for the Democrats. So that's one of the big things, is what does the making up look like if John Cornyn becomes the nominee? Is Ken Paxton really going to say, hey, we got to support John Cornyn now? Vice versa. That's pretty hard to imagine too. That's going to be interesting to see. And then the other piece that we've been talking about a lot is, and we'll get to this with some of the other polling stuff floating around out there, is, once we get through these primaries, do any of these Republicans start to make some distance? Do we say, we all agree the border is the most important problem, but, we got to make sure we target enforcement? Do we see some questions about, the value of tariffs? I just, kind of that's the next step that I'm kind of waiting for here to see what happens.
And thinking about Donald Trump coming to Texas, we should note that Trump's numbers remain in the band that they've been overall, on the low end of the band.
Yeah.
But he's still, I think, just over 80% job approval among Republicans,
right?
Which again is about where he's been living,
right?
And still strong in the areas that he's always been strong,
right?
Including immigration, and I think that's something we'll probably take up next week. But while there's some signs of skepticism out there, and we need to do some parsing, overall, I would say Republicans are pretty much sticking with the president, even amidst the difficulty, shall we say, of the immigration enforcement effort.
Yeah.
And certainly their underlying attitudes, as we've said in here before, and this poll found that again, their underlying general attitudes about immigration have not changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
In any significant way. I mean...
Yeah, and that's right, and I think, but actually, what that does is it almost creates more challenges, because if you're, if you're one of these Republicans, in Texas, let's say, running up by the Panhandle, no problem, no difference whatsoever in anything you've been doing, past, present, or future. But if you are running, say, in Williamson County, if you are running in Tarrant County, right, if you are kind of, on one of the exurbs, fast-growing areas outside of Houston or near, Galveston, it's like, ooh, that might work for Republicans, but the numbers among independents are bad.
Right, and the other piece of that is that, well, we saw some slight abatement in some of the economic numbers at the macro level.
Yeah.
In terms of people's retrospective and prospective assessments of economic issues writ large, it's still a problem.
Yeah.
And the level of concerns about prices in the top 4 or 5 items in that price battery, still pretty high.
Yeah.
Higher among Democrats and independents than among Republicans, but still higher among Republicans than I think is the comfort zone if you're running as the incumbent party.
Yeah. For sure.
And so that's all in there, and I would urge people to look at that. Anything else you want to throw in?
I just think this is a good poll overall. I think there's a lot to dig into here. I hope people spend some time, getting into these numbers a little bit. I mean, I think it definitely corresponds to a lot of what we've been seeing. I mean, I've been waiting for this. I think you've been waiting too. I mean, we've been talking all along about it's too early. And it's like, well, now we're here, and
right.
But overall, I think, the underlying data really does paint a picture and tell a story about what's going on here, and we'll see what the electorate ultimately decides.
But even then, in terms of our too early argument, the number of people who said they'd heard a lot about the Senate primary got bigger but still not.
It's
still way below all the big national stories.
Well, and I think this is one of the biggest thing about this cycle here in Texas so far for me, at least going over many cycles, is this sort of this disjuncture between sort of the elite attention and focus on the one hand, and that's what happens. You got two multiple statewide incumbents. You've got an active Democratic side. It's all the factors we've talked about multiple times. But I mean, the inability of people to sort of, I don't know, step outside their bubble and sort of ask the question, like, are normal people paying attention to this? Because and that's why we always ask in the poll, are you paying attention to this? And the answer is like, most people are not. And even though we've finally gotten to this point where a quarter of the electorate is paying a lot of attention, but like, that's where we're at. And not even all those people are going to vote, So it's just something to keep in mind here and remember, especially in some ways in this world we live in now, it's even easier to not pay attention to a lot of this stuff if you don't want to. And so I think for the hyper-focused among us, maybe part of this the election cycle, part of it's the environment, we get to be even more hyper-focused. And then for those people who don't want to be, that's just like, and we've talked about this, like information polarization, and Trump. It's like some people are like absorbing everything all the time. And a lot of people are like, get me out of here. I don't want to be anywhere near any of this stuff. People even might be engaged with politics sometimes, don't want to be.
And there's a national state level divide there. I mean, the national environment is so active.
Yeah.
And it's been a tactic that has more or less served them well. And the Trump administration is clearly, it's generally accepted about velocity, volume and velocity.
Right.
You keep doing things and things are out there and it crowds out state level stuff and it crowds out election politics in a midterm election in a pretty big way. And that's already a dynamic separate from whatever the approach of the Trump administration is. And so we've got some countervailing dynamics. On one hand, the early voting looks like we're going to have pretty good turnout year again.
Yeah.
On the other, certainly compared to the past, but we also have to remember that the benchmark of the past is very low.
Right.
So on that, we've focused very tightly on the Senate race.
Yeah.
We're sort of given in to the interest in that. There's a lot more in the poll, so go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu. There'll be links on the front page to various versions of this data. You can find it in our data archive. There's a link that says latest poll on the front page. You'll find a very prominent link to the rollout post for this poll that parses some of this out. Some of it you'll have read here, heard here. A lot of it you'll not have heard yet. So have a look at that on the website. Again, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Josh, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks again to the excellent production team, as always, in the Dev Studio here in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Most of all, thanks to you for listening. Visit the website, have a look at these results, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.